welcome everybody.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for letting us know that. I think we'll turn it over to Phoebe to share a little bit more about where we're coming from.
Yeah, and we'll, for those of you who have already participated in a webinar, the next few minutes will have some repetition for you, but we want to make sure that everyone sort of has a sense of why we're doing this and where we're coming from. So we'll go through this briefly. You see here a map of the Smithsonian museums on the National Mall, which spans from the Washington Monument to the US Capitol. And both of our museums are actually located a few blocks north of the mall, in that purple circle you see there, in the old patent office building. So that's where we're located physically. We represent 2 of the 19 museums and galleries, plus the National Zoo, that constitute the Smithsonian. And here's our building, where you can see both Smithsonian American Art Museum and National Portrait Gallery artworks. SAM, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, houses over 44,000 works of art spanning more than 300 years of American history, from the colonial period up through the present day. And we're really interested in understanding the American experience and celebrating the creativity of artists whose works really explore American history, culture, and global connections as well. And our artworks include everything from painting, sculpture, works on paper, photography, to video and new media. So it's a really expansive collection. And Ashley will tell you about the portrait gallery.
Sure. So the National Portrait Gallery tells the multifaceted story of the United States by presenting portrayals of individuals who have shaped the nation's history and culture. And this also includes the only complete collection of presidential portraits outside of the White House.
That's awesome.
So we're really excited that this webinar is a part of the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative, called Because of Her Story, which was launched in 2018. The initiative is one of the country's most ambitious undertakings to date. And the aim of the initiative is to research, collect, document, display, and share the compelling story of women. It is all-inclusive. We really seek to highlight stories of those who identify as women, those who identify female but self-identify differently. So really sort of gender diversity is a big part of this initiative. With a digital first mission and focus, we hope to use technology to amplify a diversity of women's voices, not just in one gallery or museum, but throughout the Smithsonian's many museums, research centers, cultural heritage affiliates, and wherever people are online. We really want to reach as many people as we can all around the world, in Washington, including Washington, D.C., across the nation, and everywhere else in between.
Great. And the reason that we're able to be here with you tonight in this webinar is that Sam and MPG collaborated on this project, which the goal was really to expand the representation of women in classrooms around the country. And we wanted to do that by giving teachers resources to use artworks from both of our collections representing a diverse range of women's stories. So we have created a set of 6 teaching posters, which I think many of you have hopefully already received. And each webinar in the series is based on around 2 of the 6 images. So tonight we'll be looking at Lorraine Hansberry and Alma Thomas. And if you've registered for this webinar and you've not already received a set of posters, you will be mailed your set in the coming weeks. And just to talk about the goals of the webinar series briefly, we want to explore how American art and portraiture can bring diverse women's stories into your classroom, model strategies that you can use to engage your students in close looking, discover interdisciplinary connections, and think about how you might use these artworks and stories to connect to what you're doing in your classroom. And today's essential question that we'll be focusing on is this idea of how have women created space for themselves in the arts and culture? This idea of breaking barriers.
So before we jump in, I wanted to mention that we'll be revisiting some of the thinking routines from previous webinars, which are also available through YouTube, and this one, including this one and the others will be shared with all of you. I'm going to begin with the routine called See, Think, Wonder. You guys can see the routine in front of you. And I'm going to start by posing a question to Phoebe, and then later I'll post a question for those participating to include in the chat box. When sort of administering See, Think, Wonder, we'd like everybody to think about the elements of portrayal in the photograph that we'll show to you guys. And the elements of portrayal include things like pose, expression, hairstyle, medium, scale, setting, objects, color, and clothing. So the first image that we're taking a look at, this is Lorraine Hansberry by the photographer David Altie from 1959. Before we sort of jump in, Phoebe,
Yes.
would you mind talking a bit about what it is that you see when you look at this photograph?
Yeah. So taking a long, close look at this photograph, what I noticed first is this woman's smile, Lorraine Hansberry's smile. It's really broad, it's bright. Her talking about pose, her posture looks very open to me. But then I notice that there's another representation of her, what looks like on the back wall.
Yeah.
And her pose is pretty different. Looks like she's sort of hiding her face.
Okay.
I noticed that she's holding what looks like a pen in her hand, which maybe I won't go into what I think quite yet. Looks like there's another image of her sitting on a desk behind her.
Yep.
There's also a stack of what looks like papers, a lamp. And then in the upper right, I see what looks like a sculpture, kind of a modernist sculpture, and a poster that seems to say "A Raisin in the Sun."
Awesome, thank you, Phoebe. So the next question is, what do you think about that? So all the things that you've just observed, sort of what sort of comes up for you?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm kind of trying to reconcile these multiple images of Lorraine Hansberry and sort of the differences that I see. And I'm wondering, I guess moving into wonder,
Yeah.
I'm wondering why the artist chose to represent her in multiple different ways in one image, what he's trying to convey about her identity and who she is. And it's interesting to me that the work that she's most well known for, A Raisin in the Sun, it's kind of tucked away and hidden in the back. You can see it there, but it's not front and center.
Yeah.
It's really her and her pen and her smile that stand out to me. So it's really an intriguing portrait, I think, and raises a lot of interesting questions about who she is, you know, in a public way and what is going on in her more private life.
Yeah, so thank you, Phoebe. And one of the things Phoebe mentioned was sort of the third part of this exercise, which is, what does it make you wonder? So for those that are participating, please sort of share your thoughts in the chat room about what this particular image makes you, what does it make you wonder? And a couple of, as you guys are typing, you know, consider these questions, right? So when you're looking closely at the objects in the photograph, how do they shape or inform the story that's being told through a teased image? When you're wondering, how would you describe the artistic technique that's being used for this portrait? And then finally, sort of what adjectives would you use to describe Hansberry's facial expressions, like Phoebe? How might they convey parts of her personality? So please share your answers in the chat box. Excellent. So someone mentioned some of the adjectives that came up were complex or layered.
I like that idea of layered.
Yeah.
And someone is kind of adding to that past, present, future.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
In deep thought.
Wonders about why there are 3 likenesses of Hansberry and 1 portrait. Who is she with? That's a question.
Yeah.
Noticing that there are essentially 4 figures in the work. Interesting.
Yeah.
Calling her smile inviting. She looks deep in thought. Wondering what she's thinking about. Wondering why the background large picture is blurred. Yeah.
So the thing that I love the most about this particular routine is that it encourages students to make careful observations through thoughtful interpretations. That helps stimulate curiosity and sets the stage for inquiry. So thank you guys for your answers. So to get into some background information about the photograph, this is actually from April 1959, which is 1 month after her Broadway play, A Raisin in the Sun, premiered on Broadway. This particular image was printed for Vogue magazine, actually, so printed for a fashion magazine in June 1959. As you guys mentioned, it's a double image portrait of the playwright that also includes, as you all have mentioned, a framed image of Hansberry. And so T sort of incorporated the use of 2 different negatives resulting in 1 single print. So you have the enlarged image on the left. The subject is shown with her eyes cast downward and her left hand to her temple. The artist was known for his emotional, intimate portraits and also his use of multiple image techniques. So about Lorraine Hansberry, she was the first African-American woman to have a play performed on Broadway. She was born in Chicago in 1930 to call Augustus Hansberry, a real estate broker, and her mother, Nanny Louise. In 1938, her father bought a house in the predominantly white neighborhood of the South Side of Chicago. And unfortunately, their neighbors, their white neighbors, tried to force the family out of the neighborhood, which had a profound effect on Lorraine. This particular traumatizing experience would later influence her most important work, the play A Raisin in the Sun. The play was incredibly successful. Hansberry became the first African-American playwright to win the coveted New York Drama Critics Circle Award. Hansberry was also a longtime civil and women's rights activist. And was a really outspoken supporter of the movement's increasing sort of militance. Declaring that African Americans had a great deal to be angry about. She warned that chaos could result if the federal government failed to move decisively to combat racial injustice. So like thinking about sort of her personality and then looking at this image, right? Sort of two very sort of different people. Something that's also really interesting is that while she was working on A Raisin in the Sun, she contributed letters to The Ladder, which was the first subscription-based lesbian publication of the United States, right? So sort of big themes in her work sort of dealt with her interest in sort of women's rights and civil rights. Women's financial independence was a really big theme in her work. And then sort of this sort of shift between the themes and the mission of the civil rights movement and the emergence of the Black Power movement. She's one of the artists that were involved in the 1963 historic James Baldwin, Robert F. Kennedy meeting. She was only one of 3 women to attend that particular event. Where these artists sort of talked with then Attorney General Kennedy about race relations and sort of how to fix them in the United States. Unfortunately, she died a few years later at the age of 34 in 1965. But before then, she wrote the screenplay for the movie adaptation of her play A Raisin in the Sun, which sort of starred Sidney Poitier. But she was an incredibly prolific writer. And just really, really engaged and sort of breaking the barriers, which we've talked about, right, of sort of who she's supposed to be and what her works represent. And I think, as we move forward, just sort of keep that in mind with the women that we're addressing during this particular webinar. So sort of back to the thinking routine of See, Think, Wonder. I think one of the wonderful things about these thinking routines is that you can adapt them to meet your needs, whatever your needs are in the classroom. So now that I've provided all this information about Hansberry, what are additional wonderings that you might have now, right? Once you have this biographical information, what are more things that you want to learn about Hansberry or T or the image itself? So we're going to move on to the next image, and we're shifting the focus from a famous sitter to a famous artist. And then Phoebe will address how we can make meaning from abstract objects.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I just love, before I move into this, I think that image could work so beautifully in any of the 3 themes that we talked about in these 3 webinars. It connects to activism and identity and this idea of breaking barriers, and just thinking about like comparing this work to the portrait of Dolores Huerta that you have in your poster set.
Yeah.
Thinking about who is an activist, that could be a really interesting connection.
Yeah.
So that was just occurring to me. I am going to move into looking at a more abstract work than we've looked at so far in these webinars. And I encourage you to take a long look at this from home as I'm discussing it with Ashley. Feel free to jump in on the chat box with any observations if you have something you'd like to share, but feel free to just think for yourself and follow along with the conversation if you prefer. So Ashley, I'm going to ask you, as you're taking a slow look at this artwork, where does your eye go first?
It's a good question. So that black circle in the middle, that's immediately where my eye goes first. And then it sort of peels sort of the outside, goes to the outside layers.
Okay, so you start with that dark circle in the upper right, and then your eye kind of travels outward, sort of following those concentric circles.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool. So we've got sort of this asymmetrical composition with that sort of leads your eye gradually from upper right to the rest of the painting. Does this painting remind you of anything when you look at it?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's funny, the first thing that came up was sort of a hot plate before it's at capacity, right? Like when it's like warming up before it gets like fully red. It also kind of reminded me of my mom's like colorful like placement mats that she had growing up. But I think the thing that it really reminds me of are these like the album color for like Songs in the Key of Life, or like those like 70s like soul album colors that were like super colorful and really into rainbows. That's kind of what this reminds me of a lot actually.
Those are all awesome connections. It's funny, when I look at it, I always think of like an eyeball really up close with like a dilated pupil, which is kind of terrifying, but there are so many things that come to mind with the colors and the shapes that we see here. And thinking about those colors, we see both cool colors sort of radiating out from that, that place where you said your eye went first, these blues, bluish green, purple, and then to warm colors in the outer rings. So we've got sort of this contrast going on. So we've talked about composition, we've talked about the shapes and colors. And when we're looking at an abstract work like this, we can also think about the way that the artist has applied paint to the canvas. So thinking about something like brush stroke or texture. How would you describe the brush strokes or the way that you think Thomas has applied to the canvas?
It almost reminds me of like cracked Adobe, right? Like this idea of like, it's not quite connected. There's almost like cracks. I know someone mentioned like a braided rug, like a braided rag rug.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of that too as well. But this idea of, well, everything is connected, it's also not, like everything is sort of its own square, its own block, and there's sort of these different sort of white areas in between where things aren't quite connected.
Yeah, this idea of cracked, and it's almost like, I think of like mosaic or something.
Yeah, for sure.
So thinking about like, just a rhetorical question, think about what this painting might look like if these were just like solid circles of color, and what effect that would have. Taking all these choices together that the artist made, the asymmetry, the irregular brush strokes of different sizes and widths, those contrasting colors, to me, I get a sense of motion from that, and sort of a sense of energy, that this isn't a static image. It's sort of like almost like radiating or pulsing with energy.
Yeah.
That's what I feel when I look at it. And you may have your own interpretation. And that's the great thing about abstract art, is anyone can have their own interpretation. I'm going to share the title with you and date, if Anne can bring that up. So this is a painting by Alma Thomas called The Eclipse, made in 1970. So on March 7th in 1970, there was a total solar eclipse that was visible in most parts of North America, which we imagine may well have inspired Thomas to make this painting. If you remember the eclipse from, was it last year or 2018? So it's a huge event that everyone is pretty aware of for the most part. But that wasn't the only recent event that had Americans sort of looking to the skies. As you know from history, about 8 months before that, in July of 1969, the Apollo 11 mission landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon, where they were the first men to take steps on the moon, which was, of course, a defining moment of American history. And Alma Thomas, the artist, was inspired by this moment, as were so many Americans. And it really inspired a new period in her artwork, inspired by space and these celestial themes, which moved away from her earlier works that were more focused on sort of botanicals and earth-based natural imagery. And
Phoebe, just before, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm seeing more folks are joining us and sort of participating in the chat box, which is awesome. Some of you, your settings are that you're sending your messages just to the panelists, which is just the three of us. So if you could check that you're sending your chat box comments to all panelists and attendees, if you just click the arrow, the drop down menu, and then select that setting. That way, not just the three of us, but everyone who's participating is going to be able to read these fantastic comments that are coming in. So thank you all for that.
Thanks, Anne. So we've looked at one painting by Alma Thomas, but what I really want to get into is her story, which I think is really one of the most fascinating stories of an artist that I know. Anne, would you go to the next slide? Thank you. So this is Alma Thomas. This is a photograph of her from 1968. And Thomas was born in Georgia in 1891 to a middle-class African-American family. And her family relocated to Washington, D.C. when Alma was a teenager. Thinking about being an African-American family in the South in 1891, and around that time, her childhood coincided with a period of really intense racist violence and intimidation and discrimination in the South, and her parents decided for the family's safety and for seeking opportunities to relocate them to DC. DC was still a segregated city, but offered opportunities that were unavailable in Georgia at the time. So Alma began studying art when she was a high school student, and then actually went on to attend Howard University, which is the prestigious historically Black university in DC. And she became the first graduate of its newly established fine arts program in 1924. When she graduated, she got a job teaching art at Shaw Junior High School in DC, where she remained for over 35 years. She really made her career as a teacher for most of her life. But she also remained active in the art scene in Washington, exhibiting her work in local group shows. She helped establish DC's first integrated art gallery. And she also made it a priority to bring art and the local art scene to her students, bringing them to galleries and museums, arranging lectures by local artists, and really making a point to instill knowledge and appreciation of African-American achievements in arts and culture. Her own painting during that time was really mostly in a realistic style, unlike that abstract work we just looked at. And she didn't really begin to experiment with abstraction until she was close to retirement in the 1950s. She started taking weekend art classes at American University, and she was inspired by sort of this burgeoning local art movement that became known as the Washington Color School, that was really interested in exploring color theory and abstraction. So she actually didn't begin to really paint full time until she retired from teaching when she was 69 years old. And she was struggling with painful arthritis at this time, but she went on and used her home as her studio. And she really blossomed as an artist in her 70s and 80s, and developing this signature style that we see in those paintings behind her and in the eclipse. I have a quote from her where she says, "Through color, I have sought to concentrate on beauty and happiness rather than on man's inhumanity to man." So, thinking about her backstory, she's certainly aware of segregation, racism, discrimination that's going on around her, but she used her art as a way to celebrate the beauty in her life that she found in nature and in the world around her. So I think this is just really interesting, looking back to the Lorraine Hansberry image we talked about, and two African-American women, similar periods of time, sort of dealing differently in their artwork with these issues. So talking about her success in the art world, she actually became the first African-American woman to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. This is in 1972 when she's 80 years old. So you can see it in the photograph on the right there. This is her at her show. And she talks about, in her childhood, museums were still segregated in many places, and she wouldn't have even been able to go in, let alone have her own show.
That's wonderful.
And so her legacy does continue, and in fact, the Obamas borrowed 2 of her paintings from the Smithsonian to display in the White House during their presidency, and one of her paintings became the first painting by an African-American woman to be acquired by the permanent collection of the White House in 2015.
Phoebe, someone's noting that they love the style of her dress. Wondering if she made them, because there really is this like resonance between what she's wearing and the artworks that we see here.
That is so true, and you could do a whole See Think Wonder with just these photographs too.
It reminds me of the Michelle Obama portrait that was just done, Amy Sherwood.
The Amy Sherwood portrait,
Like sort of just the geometric shapes on the clothes.
Absolutely. All right, and then moving on, I just want to show you a little bit of the scope of Thomas's work, because it's hard to get a sense from just one painting. So this is sort of a little snapshot of her career. In the upper left there, that's a painting that actually belongs to the Hirshhorn Museum. And that is an early work from the 1950s while she was still teaching, where she's still using a more realistic style, doing this still life. The central image on the top row is from 1959, right when she's starting to experiment with abstraction, but you can see she hasn't quite landed on that signature style of hers yet. Then in the top right, this is a painting that she did in the 60s, where she's, it's very linear, but she's got that sort of dappled brushstroke effect that she uses throughout her most famous paintings. And then on the bottom row there, we see her starting to get more experimental and using different shapes and color combinations. And the painting in the bottom right is one of my favorites. It's actually on view in the museum right now. It's called White Roses Sing and Sing, and this is one of her later works. And you really see how she's experimenting with movement and motion and just making these paintings really dynamic, and she's confident in her style. And just that title, White Roses Sing and Sing, is so poetic to me. And I'll just close with this, offering this idea and this connection to those of you who are English teachers, to think about how Alma Thomas captures the essence of something with just these few choices of color and line and shape and texture, and how this might connect to stylistic choices that writers make. Thinking about things like word choice and tone and poetic format and things like that. I think there's a lot you could do there connecting stylistic choice.
Yeah, Phoebe, there's a question about about medium, whether this is paper or paint.
This is paint. These are mostly paintings on canvas. Most of the paintings we have in our collection are paintings on canvas, oil on canvas. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley now to look at supplemental work that's not in your poster set.
No, it isn't, but it's still just as fabulous. So someone in the chat box actually asked about an activity about abstraction, but I think the activity that we're going to do with this photograph is a way that can be possibly applied for an abstract painting. So we're actually moving back to photography because I love it so much. And like I said, we'll be talking through a creative writing activity that might be of use to all of you participating, but we're going to start off with this image of the Scottsboro Boys and Juanita Jackson Mitchell by Britton and Patterson from 1936. This is a gelatin silver print. This particular photograph features 8 of the 9 Scottsboro Boys with Juanita Jackson Mitchell, Laura Kellum, and Dr. Ernest W. Taggart, which was taken inside the Alabama prison where the Scottsboro Boys were being held. In 1931, they were falsely accused of raping 2 white women aboard a freight train, and the 9 African-American teenagers were tried in Scottsboro, Alabama, hence their name, the Scottsboro Boys, what became a sensational case attracting national attention. So this is actually one of the few photographs featuring most of the group. It was taken in November 1936 outside of the prison where they had been held for 5 years. This particular photograph originally appeared in the NAACP publication, The Crisis, in January of 1937, and later it was reprinted that spring in Life magazine. So today we're going to be focusing on one of the women in the photograph, Juanita Jackson Mitchell. So to start off, I'm actually going to ask Phoebe a question about the particular image. And for those participating, please feel free to join in and jot down notes on your own. And we're going to circle back to finish the activity once I share some biographical information. And again, just reminding everybody to keep in mind the elements of portrayal, like pose and clothing. So Phoebe, based on what you see, what are some words that come up when you look at Jackson Mitchell?
Yeah, so I think one of the first words that came to mind is professional,
okay.
And sort of competent.
Yeah.
I think she has this air about her where she looks like she knows what she's doing, and she looks confident also in the place where she is. She's well dressed. She looks direct. I mean, she's gazing right at us.
Yeah.
She's not looking away. You know, and one of the words that is coming to my mind, which doesn't describe her directly, but I think it applies here, is just solidarity.
Yeah.
Just the way she's standing in this line with these men, and I didn't notice at first, but she's holding one of their hands.
I think they're all,
they're
a lot of them are
holding hands. So that idea of solidarity stands out to me.
Yeah. So this is sort of the first step in the activity, and I'm going to share some biographical information. So Juanita Jackson Mitchell, who is the 4th from the left, was the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Maryland Law School in 1950, and the first to be admitted to the Maryland bar. And while at Maryland Law, she's also the first Black woman to serve as editor of the Law Review. So she was born in Hot Springs, Arkansas in 1913, but grew up actually in Baltimore, Maryland. She received her bachelor and master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania at a time when not many Black women were attending Ivy League colleges. After graduating from college, she founded the citywide Young People's Forum, which was a civil rights organization that also helped African Americans during the Depression find jobs. And then she later became the vice president of the National Council of Methodist Youth. And then afterwards became a special assistant to Walter White, who was then the president of the NAACP. So, Jackson Mitchell was a very busy young woman. In 1936, she became the first national director of the NAACP's Youth and College Division. This also just happened to be the same year of this particular photograph. So she's just starting this sort of brand new position that she's creating, one that was literally made just for her to leverage her strengths. And she was asked by the NAACP to travel to Scottsboro to deliver a pledge of support from thousands of young people around the country for the 9 young men. this is sort of just the start of her, several decades working for the NAACP. This is a really sort of interesting picture, right? The start of someone's career, doing sort of really interesting but heartbreaking work. But during her tenure as a national youth director, she galvanized thousands of young people into supporting anti-lynching campaigns, fighting racial discrimination in public education, and really creating voter registration drives for African Americans, both in the Baltimore area and beyond. One of the examples would be in 1942 when she directed a march on Maryland's Capitol with 2,000 citizens. And sort of drove the first citywide register and vote campaign. That campaign resulted in 11,000 new voter registrations on the books. And then she did the same thing again in 1958, and that resulted in 20,000 new registrations, which is pretty amazing. Years later, Mitchell will be a part of the legal team supporting Robert Mac Bell in a really famous sit-in case that would go all the way to the Supreme Court. And even towards the end of her career in the 1960s, she was still doing really amazing things, right? She was appointed to presidential commissions by both presidents, Roosevelt, Kennedy, and then finally Lyndon B. Johnson.
Ashley, I'm gonna pop in here because there's some really great questions and observations in the chat box.
Yeah.
So you're talking about how this photograph was taken towards the beginning of Bonita Jackson Mitchell's career, and there was a comment about Hansberry and Thomas that it's interesting to think about like the different stages of their lives and careers, where Hansberry was, so young at the time of her untimely death. And then Alma Thomas had this sort of, second career in life in her 70s and 80s. So it's really interesting to even think about sort of that element when we look at the work of the photographs of the work of these women. There was a question about who the other woman is in this photograph.
Great question. So the other young woman is Laura Kellum, who at the time was the NAACP rep for Alabama. So she's joined with, they're both NAACP representatives who were there to support the Scottsboro boys. And I think a part of what they were doing too was raising money to help them once they were out of jail.
And before, I think it's important to sort of say that a comment came in about featuring the women that we're featuring, that it's important that history books do not bury them anymore. And so I would just throw that to you as the women's history.
Yeah, that's my job.
Like, this is exactly what we're trying to do with, and Ashley specifically with her role and connection to the Smithsonian Women's History Initiative.
I mean, that's why I chose this photograph, right?
Yeah.
You're someone that I didn't even know about until sort of uncovering this image, but I really want to circle back to the observation about sort of these three really different Black women in sort of different areas, right? So we have a visual artist, we have a writer and civil rights activist, and then we have this young woman who's just incredibly political activist, lobbyist, who also, I don't know if you guys know anything about Maryland history, but both her husband and her son were really prominent in Maryland politics for a really long time too as well. But both sort of carving out their niche. And some of these niches, unfortunately, don't last for a very long time, right? But it's interesting to see that regardless of the stage that you are in your life, there's still, there's still the opportunity to make an impact, right, through your work, which is a part of why, they broke so many barriers, is because, through their work, and some of them, like with Thomas or Hansberry, their short tenures, they were able to really, change the way that people look at art.
Yes.
So back to the amazing Juanita Jackson Mitchell. So I've given you all this information. In the beginning, I talked to Phoebe about sort of what her impressions were like. And so what happens now is that you would walk students through the activity, asking them what their impressions are of the image and what they think, provide sort of biographical information. And then the next step with all this information would to create a 6-word memoir. So 6-word memoir is an actual activity that we administer in the museum. And I'm actually going to show you an example of my 6-word memoir, which is a lobbyist can wear ermine too. And what's great about the 6-word memoir is that it's a chance for students to connect their initial assumptions and impressions with an image with the biographical image that they just learned, right? So this is a chance to both think critically about what it is that you see, but to also connect that with like, okay, so how does this change the way that I'm viewing this particular image? Does it shift the way that I see this particular image? Or does it affirm what I feel about this particular image too? But as Phoebe said, you know, these things are open to interpretation, so there's no necessarily right answer, but it's just a way of both encouraging students to participate and share their own sort of thoughts, but to also ask them to expand what it is that they believe about a particular image. And what's great about the 6-word memoir is that it helps students sort of slow down to make careful, detailed observations by encouraging them to push beyond first impressions or obvious features. When you're thinking about the Alma Thomas, right? Like you're asking them to really sort of go beyond just the colors, right? You're asking them to think about like the technique and the style and, you know, the differences in colors that she uses, right? The warm and the cool. And so it's a really fantastic activity to participate in.
Okay, so we have time to focus on one more artwork. And the final artwork that we're going to be discussing today is a self-portrait from Sam's collection. So I guess at Sam we also do have portraits. MPG is not the only museum with portraits. One way that we can begin to think about the choices that artists make when they're representing themselves in a self-portrait is to think about how we would represent ourselves. And in the age of sort of, you know, we all have a camera in our pocket all the time. Our students perhaps take multiple selfies a day with their phones.
Constantly making self-portraits.
Constantly making self-portraits. So it's a I think self-portraits are a very accessible way to have students begin to think about portraiture. So what you're seeing here is a self-portrait brainstorming guide, and it's focusing on sort of 4 of those different elements, some of those elements of portrayal that Ashley was talking about, things like clothing, pose, objects and setting. So the guide sort of asks you not just to think about what you would include in your self-portrait, but why, right? What do you want that element to communicate by wearing this, by positioning your body in this way, by including this object, or by placing yourself in this location or this setting? So of those 4 elements, clothing, pose, object, setting, I'm wondering if you could share in the chat box, which one stands out for you when you first look at this self-portrait by artist Romaine Brooks, which was done in 1923.
So their options again were clothing,
pose, objects, setting.
I'm interested to see what people say.
Yeah.
Setting, clothing, that hat.
Yeah.
Also, people probably in totally different parts of the country saying that hat at the same time. Clothing. So this gray, sort of the gray tones, the glove, right?
Yeah.
So not like clothing that includes, you know, accessories, right? What are on your hands, what's on your head. Noticing the sort of the jury city. And then also with colors, right? The gray, but then there are these like really tiny subtle pops of
the
color.
rouge.
Yeah, the rouge, exactly.
Yep. A lot of clothing.
Yes. So, the fact that you can't see her eyes. So yeah, you guys are picking up on this is an artwork that the more you look at it, the more interesting it becomes to me. So just things to note, that the clothing and the accessories that go with the clothing, there's this, you know, it's masculine tailoring, but there's something very androgynous about sort of how she's wearing what she's wearing. Yes, exactly. Androgynous just came into the chat box. And to go back to the idea of, you know, what we can see in terms of her face. So it's this very like direct gaze, right? And she's looking sort of directly at the viewer in some ways, and yet her eyes are also in shadow. So there's this sort of like, there's just blurry lines kind of all over the place here. And then these shades of gray that have been mentioned, but then with these sort of, there's these pops, right? And also the setting of this sort of, the word dreary came up, with sort of dreary cityscape. I think of David Bowie, right? Yes. So this is what I love about these sort of conversations. I have never thought of David Bowie when looking at this, but now I will, right? And I absolutely get it. So that's fantastic. So the artist here, Romaine Brooks, was born in 1874, and she lived a very long life. She died in 1970. She was an American expatriate. She was an heiress of a multi-million-dollar fortune who lived most of her life in Paris. She was a lesbian who in the early 1900s crafted an androgynous appearance that challenged conventional ideas of how women should look and how women should behave. And so in her work, she typically depicts women, often in the same gray tones that you see here. And so Brooks's biographer, Cassandra Langer, has said, she was one of the first modern artists to depict women's resistance to patriarchal representations of the female in art. She understood that women in art had been treated as objects rather as subjects, and she made it her mission to change that. So when we're thinking of how the women included in this webinar are breaking barriers, you know, that's what Remaking Brooks had in mind. It's important to note that she was an independently wealthy white woman, right? And so her race and her money put her in this uniquely privileged position where she could present herself and create her art in a way that defied the conventions of the day. And so in that way, she broke barriers both in her personal life and her professional life. We're gonna watch a short clip of a curator discussing what I've just mentioned. And you're gonna see the National Portrait Gallery's logo. You see it right there at the top, National Portrait Gallery in the video. Because this video was created for an MPG exhibition called Hide Seek, which was at the Portrait Gallery several years ago. But the painting is in Sam's collection. Again, this is where the lines between our museums get a little bit blurry. But this artwork is owned by Sam. In fact, Sam owns about half of the work that Remaking Brooks created. Self-portrait is probably her most famous image. So it's a Sam image that was lent to the Portrait Gallery for one of their exhibitions. This clip is just about a minute long.
One of the striking things about the artist Remaking Brooks, and in fact, Brooks's sexuality is always in evidence in almost everything she does. And that was enabled by a question of social class. In 1903, she had inherited $9 million. So this is a woman who was immediately transformed into one of the wealthiest women in America. She didn't circulate these paintings. She didn't need a dealer. She didn't care about the art market. And that gave her a freedom that practically unparalleled at this historical moment to represent sexuality as she understood it, as she saw it. And we can see here that she's playing in this very carefully contrived and posed self-portrait with a form of representation that flirts with all sorts of codes of masculinity without going over into drag. She's not dressed as a man, but she is dressed both fashionably and mannishly. And in so doing, she's, according to the codes and contexts of her time, seeking to overturn one of the most common assumptions governing the world of women, which is that you move from your father's home to your husband's home, and thus we're always a dependent. This portrait works to overturn that visually.
So before we sort of leave Remaking Brooks and get to our final minutes where we can sort of hear from you all about how, what's resonating with you and your ideas for using these works in your classroom, I wanted to place Brooks's self-portrait in conversation with two photographs that were taken of the artist. And so if we had more time, we'd, you know, sort of flesh each one of these things out, but just questions I'll pose for you to think about on your own. This notion of self-portraiture or self-representation or self-presentation versus having your likeness captured by someone else. And then along with that, even looking at these three images, looking at the similarities and the differences between them, and also kind of noting changes or similarities over time. The self-portrait was done in 1923. The first photograph was done in 1910 when she was 34 years old. And then the last photograph here was taken in 1936 at the age of 60. So a lot to discuss with Remaking Brooks. Someone is sort of connecting it to our moment today, profile picture versus picture someone tagged of you. I love that.
That's
totally
perfect.
love that. That's absolutely true. So we just have a few minutes left. And so what we'd like to do is sort of, Ashley's going to take us kind of back to our essential question.
Yeah, so our essential question was, you know, how have women created space for themselves in the arts and culture? So, you know, for all of you participating, how might you incorporate these images into your teaching? And please feel free to share in the chat box.
And as we wait for some comments to come in the chat box, I really liked the comment earlier about sort of thinking about, you know, these different stages in one's career.
Yeah.
And then how you connected that actually to like the different ways in which women can break barriers and the different, you know, fields in which that can happen.
Yeah. And I really, you know, it's funny, you mentioned the grayscale that Romaine Brooks is working with. That reminds me of the Michelle Obama portrait, right? The fact that her skin is in grayscale, and, you know, there are folks that, you know, have certain reactions to the fact that, you know, it's not very lifelike, right? But hearing this idea that the grayscale was used to sort of remove any sort of intention or sort of play with sort of people's assumptions about like femininity or like, to me, makes it a little bit more interesting, actually.
So I'm seeing some comments. Julie teaches sociology, and she can see using the last photo when introducing status or judging wrongly, right? You wouldn't know her background of coming from money. The idea of the 6-word autobiography is resonating with some folks with reading and social studies. National History Day theme, triumph and tragedy. Right? Yep.
I think 2020 is going to be breaking barriers.
All right. So we're
triumph and tragedy was last year.
Okay, so 2019 and 2020 breaking barriers. So connections to the National History Day theme. Also liking the idea of creative writing and using the picture to write a story featuring an artist. Very nice. These are great suggestions.
Yeah, and we actually have a program here at NPG called Strike a Prose, and we actually bring students into the galleries, and sometimes, you know, we have listen to music if it's a particular artist, or have them read a newspaper out of a particular individual, and then generate a creative writing experience based on that.
And Cheryl, who teaches a research class called Gender, Race, and Violence, is saying, yep, all of these are going to work. So,
awesome.
But I love whether you're teaching English or you're teaching sociology or research or history, that you're finding something here.
Exactly. And someone mentioned too, loving the idea of using a photo artwork from a year that we are studying. To really, to really show sort of what's going on.
Excellent.
It's a great way to get students engaged and really like wondering about what you're going to teach. Is, you know, starting with an image, and it really piques their curiosity.
And hopefully they'll look for more stuff.
Absolutely.
So just a few closing notes to wrap things up. We mentioned earlier that we made a learning lab collection featuring all of the artworks that we looked at today, and some supporting resources. So Anne's sharing that link in the chat box right now. And it should be searchable as well. If you search, Anne, what should they search? For those who are watching the recording.
So breaking barriers.
Or
American Women's History Initiative.
Because of her story. Any of those things.
Any of that will work.
If you search on learninglab.si.edu, we'll get you there.
There was a question about whether these works are on view. So I don't, neither Sam work is on view right now, and I don't believe the MPG works are, but there is.
But the Lorraine Hansberry will be on view next summer for Her Story Women Writers exhibit. So come back in July. It actually might be online, actually, if there's an online exhibition, and we'll share that information, but it actually might be online for people to take a look at this summer.
And I mentioned earlier, there is one Alma Thomas painting on view at SAM right now, which is White Roses Sing and Sing, which we saw earlier. So we are going to mail posters to those of you who haven't already received a set. You should receive them by January 1st, and if you haven't gotten them before that, by that time, just send us an email and we'll make sure that you get your posters. One more quick plug for both of our summer teacher institutes. If you haven't attended a teacher institute at SAM or the National Portrait Gallery, and you might enjoy spending a week exploring these kinds of thinking routines and getting more comfortable integrating art into your teaching, this is a great way to do it. And you can apply now for SAM's Summer Teacher Institute for 2020. We have 2 sessions posted on our website.
And MPG also has 2 summer institutes in July too as well, which the link is there for our summer institute for next year.
Great. So we have just a few minutes left in the hour. If anyone has additional questions, we're happy to stick around and chat for a few minutes. And you have our contact information there, so you can reach out if anything comes up. And how's the chat box looking?
Looks good. there was also a comment about, I mentioned that people have been mentioning using these works to teach history and English and research and all these, but also someone is mentioning to teach social justice explicitly.
Yeah.
And I think that that's absolutely the case.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that someone stated that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a creative one too, where after teaching about an individual in history, asking students how they would create an actual portrait of this individual, and what objects and setting they would use. And then maybe, as a follow-up, finding something in our collection to sort of show them, right?
Yeah.
Like once you've created your own particular work of art,
Yeah.
here's an example from the Smithsonian, or examples of how people have interpreted this particular individual.
That can be such a cool assessment.
Yeah.
Like when you're at the end of a unit studying somebody, to have them create a portrait and then maybe write a little label for it or something.
Yeah.
That would be
That'd
such a
be
cool
great.
assignment.
So we've come to the end of our time together. We just want to thank you all for spending this
thank
hour
you.
with us at the end of the day and the end of the week. So if you have questions after we close out the webinar, our emails are there. If you register for the webinar, you have my email because it was sent to you in the registration confirmation email. So please reach out to us with additional questions or ideas. We'd love to hear from you. Well, again, we'll stick around for another minute or so if you have a specific question for us in the chat box. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening. And thank you all for the thank yous. We really enjoyed having these conversations with you.
Yes.
For sure.
This has been a pleasure. And I hope that everyone enjoys the poster sets and using these artworks in their classrooms.
All right. Oh, someone's saying that they would have students make a claim in regard to Brooks's portrait and use the details to support it. So there's a thinking routine called claim, support, question, which might be of interest.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a great one.
Oh, great. I'm hearing that all 6 posters are hanging in classrooms already.
Yay! Send us pictures.
Someone wants to know, Phoebe, are you coming to Kate this year?
Oh, hi, Anne. Unfortunately, I'm not coming to Kate this year. I'm so sorry, but I will be at some other conferences around the country. I'm going to be at NCHE in Cleveland, and I may be at NAIS in Philadelphia. So you'll have opportunities to catch me hopefully in the future. And I hope to get out to California again sometime.
All right. Okay, well, thank you all so much.
Thank you and have a good
It's been a
night.
pleasure.
Thank you.
We're going to sign off now.